Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Pao-Hands store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over the top 10 decks in the Paradox Rift format. The Latin American International Championships is right around the corner, as are a ton of regionals in this metagame, so going to be a really important one to get a grasp of. It feels similar to the 151 format in that there are many options. It still feels like a very wide format. We have some great introductions from Paradox Rift, which in some cases are brand new archetypes, and in other cases are new additions to some of the already existing decks. So there's a lot to figure out here. What are the best ways to adapt the things that we already know very well, to include the new cards and also prepare for new matchups, as well as how do the new decks fit in. Today, we're going to be talking about, firstly, the community ratings. Thanks so much to everyone who weighed in on this to give their most favorite decks that they think are going to do well in this format. But also, I've been doing a ton of data reaping from the Pokeka Book website for the Japanese tournament results, as well as the Play Limitless website for the online results in the West. So I've been really keeping tabs on what's been doing well. So if you just want to have that sort of screenshot moment right now, this is a combined graphic of what the best championship point earners were in both Japan and the online events. I've equated League Cup championship points to all the city leagues in Japan, as well as all of the online events. I actually doubled the point earnings for the two late night tournaments and the larger tournament of Doom in the online space. But essentially, yeah, think of League Cup CP for the top 8 breakdown of all of these decks. I actually initially did this, and a lot of my tweets were based on the top 16 breakdown for both of these things. But really, I realized that that was more of a popularity bias, because there was just a ton of like Roaring Moon percentage and Tina percentage in Japan, because they're just like the most played decks right now. And I feel like this graphic, where it just takes a snapshot of the top 8 point earners, is much more realistic and looks much more logical as we start looking towards this top 10. And this is really going to be the driving factor behind the top 10 ranking today, but I also have some of my own personal testing and biases, and we're looking at the matchup data from Trainer Hill as well. So let's jump straight into it. We'll start off with number 10 then. You'll see in the top of the screen, you can see the community rank as well as the earnings ranking these decks got on PTG Live and on Pokeka Book. And then we have the massive graphic of the matchup spread. And Snorlax Stall looks crazy from the Trainer Hill data right now. That's where I've got all these matchup data from. So if you question anything, you know, I may well agree with you, but this is what the data is spitting out right now. Obviously, some of these matchups will have been like less than 100 games played, so I'm sure there are going to be nuances where you could have found that the matchup's not as bad or as good as it may look on the data for all of these things. But I'm just gonna throw my hands up and say, blame Trainer Hill, don't blame me if you see something like your favorite deck is in a highly unfavorable category or whatever. But let's talk about Snorlax, because it seems to be doing much better in the online space. I think there might be a couple of reasons why it's performing less well in Japan. Firstly, the time constraints of a deck that's trying to stall in best of one may be worse in Japan, whereas the time constraints on PTG Live, at least, you know, there's shuffling and stuff like that that's done immediately on live, so you can actually get games done in time, even if you're playing online tournaments of best of one. But also, I think Giratina, one of your unfavorable matchups as Snorlax, is considerably more popular in Japan. It's pretty much like their Bidif, so that could be a reason why it's doing much better in our tournaments than it could be in Japan. And I do just want to talk about time as well, because that is a factor for Snorlax Stall. I feel like it could end up having a lot of ties just because of the nature of the archetype. You can get a long win. Sometimes you just get boshed straight away. You need to draw well pretty much every time, otherwise you're going to end up with ties. And then you have these unfavorable matchups, like Tina probably being the most high profile one. But I would also say, even though the data is suggesting Lost Box is like pretty favorable, I don't necessarily agree with that data. I feel like there are certainly ways that they can get the better of Snorlax, because they should have enough attacking threats in the archetypes that it's going to be an issue for you. So that's something I kind of question just from the offset. But it's very true that if archetypes are not prepared for Snorlax, you have so many ways of just bringing a goofball into the active and trapping it with block And with now Countercatcher, the big buff from Paradox Rift, you can continually out-resource the opponents as they move their guy out of the way in one way or another. There are 1 or 2 options that they have to switch whilst you continually countercatch them back up. Now, there are tech inclusions that many people can put into their deck list, Minior being the new one from Paradox Rift, which is just a hard tech. But I do think there are softer techs coming into decks as well, like just a Pal-Pad and Professor Churro combo if we're talking about Gardevoir, if we're talking about Charizard. Spiritomb as well could be a good tech card against Snorlax, just because it stops the Rotom drawing at the end of every single turn, so it really hurts the resources of a controlling archetype. So I think there's a lot of things that people are going to be aware of for Snorlax, and that's a bit of a worry because it's pretty one-dimensional in what it's trying to do. Right now, it feels like it's not popular enough possibly to be worth that tech inclusion, and when we are in a wide meta game, it does really feel painful to commit a space to a card that may be less than 5% of the room. But I do just want to throw it out there that its data is looking phenomenal right now. I would certainly question how good its Roaring Moon matchup is, because they should have enough resources to get over the line. I would also say that Turbo, Lost Box, Lugia, and Tina should all be pretty awkward from this spread. And also Miraidon may not even be the easiest either. I think the Charizard, the Gardy, the Chien-Pao, those all feel pretty realistically like very strong matchups outside of just like early aggression and whatnot. I feel like you should have enough to out-resource them. Let's have a look at a typical deck list then. The idea is, like I said, you're going to use these Snorlax to try and trap things here and there. We have Countercatcher, we have Erica's Invitation, we have the combination of Avery plus Echoing Horn, or just Echoing Horn Gust in the first place. We have the Misfortune Sisters trying to remove switch cards from the opponent's deck for the most part and just speeding up the mill win condition in the first place. We have Mimikyu, which is a far stronger card now that we actually have the Luxurious Cape tool card as well in the deck, because you can buff that hit point so much more substantially that just dinky little single prizes can't just deal with the Mimikyu now. It's much more awkward, and it can allow Mimikyu to be a much better penny user to spam and buy turns here and there. We do have the Crabominable plus Water Energy. I think this can help you in time constraints, obviously. And of course, this is a mirror tech option where you can just remove the opponent's cards and hope that they have less cards in deck than you do, essentially, is the idea. So a few funny things going on with the Crab. I don't think it's an essential card, but if you do expect mirror matches, you kind of have to do this. And again, it kind of helps out just with time constraints as well. Onto the tech options. Jirachi's an interesting one because I think there are a number of lost boxes that are not going to be playing Boss's Orders at all and just play Countercatcher. I think Tina could definitely be doing this, and I think Radzard could definitely be doing this as well. And if they're playing no Boss's Orders, Jirachi's actually a really good tech card to make the Sableye much less effective. Sometimes Lost Boxes and Tinas can be Sableyeing multiple block lacks so that they can't just be, completely wiped of damage with Penny and whatnot. They can place the counters around to, finish off with Shred from Tina and this, that, and the other. If, there's Bravery Charms on Snorlax and whatnot. So they can make the most out of their attacks throughout the game and set things up over a couple of different Pokemon so you're not completely always wiping them from damage. And even if there is a Sableye in the active constantly using Lost Mine, if it's onto just your active Snorlax, obviously you can just penny that target and it's similar to them just using a Shred or, hit with a Cram or whatever. So this Jirachi could be a tech card for Lost Box as long as you think that they're going to be Countercatcher based and not playing Boss still in their deck list. There are still some lists playing one copy of Boss's Orders, for example, but if you can sort of sniff that out in the game or whatever, because they're already incentivized to gust things like Rotom, for example, you can then bench the Jirachi pretty safely, and then the Sableye is far less of a problem for you. So that's an interesting inclusion. Obviously, the main downside being that if you just start this dingbat, it's really bad for you. Trekking Shoes is an interesting one, mostly because I'm terrified of just getting donked by like a Roaring Moon if they force you to go first, and you really don't have much going on. It's going to feel pretty awkward. So just having a Trekking Shoe to help you cycle, never really a bad thing. I've seen in plenty of Sanders creations that you just play these consistency cards so that you don't just get cheesed in the opening couple turns of the game. That's how people are going to steal games from you and ultimately force you to tie because you just don't get into the game whatsoever. The deck's already playing a very high counter the Poker Gears, but also maybe a trade-off between Gears and Shoes, or some of these more niche supporter cards, or just play lower counts of certain supporter cards, knowing that you can always Peonia these out of the prize cards. So yeah, I think Trekkies could be a pretty reasonable option. And then if you want to have a little bit of energy disruption, you could think about LAIC HQ and Crushing Hammer. The current stadium, of course, is Sinnoh to try and deny mostly Jet Energy from having activations here and there. But obviously just increasing the energy counts for some of these cards can buy you turns, as could 1 or 2 Crushing Hammer. I don't think you go the full 4 copies ever, but because you just play 1 or 2, it makes your opponent play quite differently, and it gives you an extra Silene target as you get down to the nitty-gritty, so could be a pretty interesting option as well. Onto Lugia. It's pretty in line with the community rank and its Pokeco book, as well as PTG Live ranker. Not too dissimilar. Still in and around that top 10 just about. out. It feels like the Vessel Lugia is very popular, but I will say that Single Strike Lugia and Colorless Lugia has still been performing relatively well, definitely in Japan. I think Single Strike has performed less well over on PTG Live so far, but that could just be new toy syndrome where more people are happy to play Vessel or Colorless builds of Lugia right now. Its matchup spread is kind of fine, actually. It seems to be okay into Roaring Moon. It enjoys coming up against Chien-Pao, which is a nice thing to see. The Iron Hands inclusion for Lugia is very, very solid. Radiant Charizard is a really nice inclusion. And your unfavorables are the Stage 2 decks, actually. The Charizard and the Gardevoir seem to be the biggest problems right now. Iron Hands is trying to alleviate your time into Gardevoir a little bit, but it still is looking to be a pretty awkward matchup, especially because Gardevoir can much more proactively target your Archeops with Screamtail, and that can actually be a huge problem for you in that they shut down your attacking threats pretty quickly and leave you with just like Lugia and Snorlax. So I think that is becoming a more awkward matchup. Onto the deck list then. We're trying out some Great Balls in the list. I feel like Great Ball does have a good amount of value right now, especially because Earthen Vessel joins your item package as an extra way of discarding cards. So just naturally using these Great Balls to hit your evolution Pokemon, your Archeops, enables that Vessel to get the full value of being an extra discard option, obviously alongside the Ultra Balls as well. So I feel like they slightly outweigh Nest Ball. Obviously it's a little bit awkward and not a great feeling when you don't have that Lugia in the opening hand and you're relying on Great Ball. It doesn't feel good, but it's a pretty nice combo card and doesn't fall off quite as much as the things like Nest Ball. Can always be insta-playable as well, which helps out your gift energy. There's so many reasons why Great Ball is just like a smoother card in the deck, and I think the fact that you play Vessel now kind of tips that over the top to be the stronger choice. You'll notice as well we are playing the water energy. This is mostly because of Block Snorlax. This could be a way that you can Aqua return your Luminion all in one turn. Of course, you just manually attach the water Archeops, the rest of the colorless energy on, and get your fish out of there. But it's not only for Block Lax, it's also going to help deny and amp you very much 3-prize turn against certain players as well. So it can be a way that stops the fish being such a liability. We are playing the 2-count of Collapse Stadium as well to try and help out with that regard, but just something worth noting here. For other options, there, like I said, has been a decent amount of just purely colorless. Lugia still doing well, and Weirdeer would probably find its way into that deck list. Pumpkaboo is always something to be considering. Right now, the main path archetypes seem to be Giratina, Roaring Moon, Lost Box, and Miraidon. These seems to be the big pathers right now. It really depends on how popular you think those archetypes are going to be, whether or not it's worth playing the Pumpkin Pits over just playing a pretty high stadium count. And then there's that contentious decision of Great Ball versus Nest Ball. I can completely understand why you would want to play Nest. It's just a guaranteed Lugia turn 1. You know, again, if Roaring Moons are making you go first, you want to have those guarantees to get multiple Lugia developed because they can just get through one pretty quickly, and they play cross switches and ropes, sometimes even coin flip catches, these sorts of things. So yeah, I definitely understand wanting to play the guaranteed search cards. Also some interesting supporter cards when you are playing some one of basic energy now, as well as some of your special energy and your attackers. Zinnias is something I see pop up periodically in a lot of the Japanese deck lists, where it's a way to discard without getting rid of the entire hand, which is always like situationally fairly reasonable. And Thornton is also another reasonable one where you're trying to cash in on your right attackers in the matchup. It can be a pretty handy way to again get the fish out of play, or can get rid of a Lugia out of play. If you've already been able to V-Star, you know, another one, that sort of thing, and develop more single prize board states. So it can be a nice fixer of the sort of prize map, but also allows you to get into the mix with one of your attackers if you've had to research them in earlier stages of the game. Onto Miraidon, the community seemed to be a little higher on this one than the results in both PTGL and Pokeka suggest. It seems to have a pretty strange matchup spread, actually. It has flipped its Gardevoir matchup to become one of your very favourables, and that's because it has the inclusion of the Iron Hands EX now. It can have really good tempo-based plays, and I still believe the best way to play Miraidon is still playing the Ionos, the Judges, and the Paths, so you have this disruption, makes life more difficult for the Gardevoir, especially, you know, if they don't respond on Iron Hands, they lose on the spot, right? So you can see that this is a much improving matchup. Interestingly, the Lost Zone boxes are still quite awkward. I think that's because we have seen this wave towards Radiant Charizard Lost Box. I think that A, gives them a great way to respond on Iron Hands, which makes it less effective as a sort of tech inclusion, but B, just Radiant Charizard is a busted card into Miraidon because you're using all 2-prize Pokemon and kind of just hit the active. So yeah, I think that's why the matchup is still kind of weak. Many of us thought that Miraidon would be flipping its Lost Box, but just the way Lost Box has adapted has meant that it hasn't quite turned out that way. It does actually claim a couple nice other favourables. The Chen Pao Caliber as well as Lugia continues to be pretty solid, pretty even into the Giratina. The main awkward matchups remain Charizard, that was the case before. Roaring Moon isn't necessarily the greatest. I feel like going first with Miraidon trying to stick Path is probably your highest odds of winning that, because Roaring Moon doesn't appreciate early Path against them. I'm also incorporating a Vacuum in my deck list to try and get rid of at least one Ancient Booster Capsule, so you have the likes of Rope, you have Vacuum and Boss's Orders now to try and find ways of KOing the Roaring Moon. Of course, you can use your Pokemon Go Zapdos to hit the crucial 230 threshold, which is pretty mandatory. I think overall it's pretty unfavorable though, because you need to have the good slice of fortune with your generators throughout the entire game just to keep up with their insane energy acceleration. The deck list in front of you really hasn't changed much from the previous successful lists that we've seen at regional championships. I'm basically just shoving in the Iron Hands to be like, hey, this is good against Gardevoir, it's a pretty solid card. You can try and find avenues to use this Anti-Very-Much attack. Also, just being a 230 hit point Pokemon, even with that arm press for the 160 damage output, can be a reasonable option. You know, into the Mirror Match, for example, it can cause all sorts of havoc just with that first attack. Also, again, just another way to get through Lugia, and it essentially like comes with a Bravery Charm, unlike, you know, the Raikou or the Miraidon that has to find those extra hit point buffs. So it's just a good card for its first attack as well, and I'm not really supporting it too much in this deck list, but I still feel like it can find many reasonable spots to be a pretty good attacker. The other main inclusion, like I said, Lost Vacuum seems like a really big card. It can help you bounce Path in other Path matchups, but it's going to also help get rid of Bravery Charm in Mirror Match situations, as well as that Ancient Booster Capsule, which is such a headache for you to deal with otherwise. The Roaring Moons are just too big. If we want to lean into the Iron Hands more, we can certainly do that. There's Raihan, there's Double Turbo Energy, there's EXP Share because you're already playing Arven. These sorts of things have definitely been experimented with and would make the Iron Hands faster and more effective. There's also definitely worlds where you just don't play the Iron Hands whatsoever. I actually think Tapu Koko EX has almost as much validity to it as the Iron Hands does. If you're just thinking Iron Hands is basically a matchup card for Gardevoir, Tapu Koko is essentially a matchup card that can help out against Charizard, it can help out against Roaring Moon, another way that you can try and two-shot them, and essentially it just leans into the more defensive side of the deck, which isn't really the thing that many people associate with Miraidon, but it does have Iono, it does have Path, it has a Judge as well, so it has ways to create awkward situations for opponents. The one thing I will say is that if people are expecting lots of block Snorlax, there may be that incentive to play more switch cards, more Professor Churros in these deck lists, so the Koko Paralysis play may not always be a guaranteed turn. So I'm a bit up in the air with the card right now. I feel like on paper it still seems really good for a couple key matchups, but because so many people may be already concerned about block, they may be just naturally playing more switch outs in the deck, which makes it less viable. Also, the Mew EX was the card that I cut to put the Iron Hands into the deck list. It's a great Iono proofer in its own right, and it can also be a valid attacker, and it has that free retreat. It still ticks many, many boxes. Super versatile card, and is one also worth considering. On to Chen Pao Caliber. The community are super high on this archetype. It's doing fairly well in Japan, but not well on PTG Live, and the data looks atrocious for it. Earlier on the video, I wanted to specify that this is the Trainer Hill data, not my opinion or anything like that. That is just what the data is telling me. So before you say, oh my goodness, look how much OmniPoke hates Chen Pao, it's not me, it's the Trainer Hill data. I do find this kind of comical, and it's pretty insane how poorly it's performing compared to the overall sentiment of how much better Chen Pao has become. And I do overall think that, yes, you can look at a lot of these matchups and figure out lines and patterns of play where you can find more favourable opportunities. And ultimately, I do think Iron Hands is a comparable win condition to the Cross-Switcher Cologne package that we were previously utilising in the archetype to help out against the Guardies, against the Lost Boxes, against Charizard to an extent as well. And I do think that playing Iron Hands, Lightning Energy, and Vessels tidies up the deck. You gain a lot of space by cutting Crossies on its own. So I do think the overall 60 actually gets a little bit smoother and should, in theory, be a little bit more consistent. I think the main thing to take away from this data is that, A, it's still not the most consistent deck, even with these small tweaks, the kind of like side/upgrades, because just seeing extra energy in the opening stages, having extra ways to reduce your hand size for the barrel with Vessel, this, that, and the other, they are definitely improving the archetype. But that being said, you're still one of the most setup-based archetypes in the format. You need to get multiple Frigi down, you need to get these Bidoof down, you need to be hitting your Iridas turn by turn so you can candy and pop off on turn 2. There's still a lot that this deck requires, even with the potential to have Iron Hands. Essentially, you just gain an even higher ceiling. Chen Pao was already the highest ceiling ceiling deck in the game that had the lowest floor, and it feels like it's going to continue to be that deck in the game where it can do the silliest, best things in the game, especially with Iron Hands in the list now, but it still has a question mark around consistency. It's really hard to talk about the matchup data. I think just on the basis of it, you can see why the Valiance matchup is pretty difficult, because you rely on so many 60 hit point evolving Pokemon, and they can all be Yoga Looped as well. I also think Miraidon was historically a poor matchup, and I think that continues to be the case. I think Lost Box converting to a Radiant Charizard approach is also not something you really like to see. I think the Giratina gets a lot worse because they now have just so many more comeback potential plays with Roxanne plus Counter Catcher plus Path, and then they can start sprinkling down your big barrels and such. And Snorlax is also a matchup that you really don't want to come up against. So I think even though the data looks atrocious, many people would agree that Chien-Pao probably is among the top 10 decks in the game, even despite this data, and will campaign that it has much better matchups into many of these decks. I do think it has been one of the more overhyped decks, definitely based on the performance that we've seen in the opening weeks, and there are still challenges for the deck. The list I've landed on is still that very heavy item-based build with the Pokestops. I'm incorporating 1 Lightning Energy, 1 Iron Hands, and the double Earthen Vessel. The reason why I like 2 Vessel, 1 Lightning rather than the other way round is that having the double Vessel really helps you keep up with Roaring Moon, even when they are using Ancient Boosters to go up all the way to 290 hit points, forcing that 5 energy discard from you. Similar reasoning for the Mew matchup. You want to have quick burst damage, so having Shivery Chill plus Vessels in the deck list really helps you have those explosive attacks from the offset. There are, of course, headaches with prizing Lightning Energy, but of course you can still remain a 1-prize attacking deck with Greninja, with Bat's Caliber for at least a little bit during the game, in the hope that you can pull your Lightning Energy out of the deck later on, so the Iron Hands can still get into the mix. There's a few big question marks still around Chien-Pao. The first one of them really is, should you be playing cross switchers like the good old days, or be making those spaces for, in my case, it was the Counter Catcher, I think it was a Nest Ball that came in, it was an extra switch that came into the deck list, and yeah, just the Water Energy Vessel stuff. So yes, the Counter Catcher is a very space-efficient way of giving yourself an item-based gust, but does the Cross Switcher work more flexibly in more situations, and just throughout the game giving yourself 2 options to gust rather than 1 Counter Catcher could still be worth the spaces and, you know, the potential clog of barrel and this, that, and the other, because it is just more flexible gust at the end of the day. There's also the question mark of cancelling clone. I still think 1 is very valid because you can maintain single prize board states and take multi-prize knockouts, certainly into the Gali matchup, into Lost Box, into Giratina, all of these sorts of archetypes. It's still a really powerful combo to have in the locker. Lost Vacuum's an interesting one. Again, that debate of how strong it is, how many path decks are going to be in the game, but also, like I said, with the second copy of the Vessel coming into my own deck list, I want to have ways to get through a very high hit point Roaring Moon, and the Vacuum is an alternative way to do this, as well as being another great card for you to hand thin with your big barrel engine. And then Kyogre is actually something I'm really considering right now, especially if you play a Counter Catcher list like I do, with the Rope and Switch both in the deck list. I feel like it's much more comfortable to play a 3 retreat cost Pokemon, and we've been lauding how powerful Screamtail is with Gardevoir. Well, Kyogre can actually perform a very similar function here, where it can be targeting down Squawkabillies and Luminions very early in the game against the Roaring Moons and the Miraidons, and it once again creates that annoying single prize board states that players don't want to come up against. Onto Mew VMAX, the community are pretty much right in line with its performance right now, both in Japan and in online tournaments. It seems to be surviving pretty nicely, even with a new Dark deck on the block. Actually, Roaring Moon is just showing as an even matchup. Oftentimes at the moment we are seeing the fusion-based build of Mew, and trying to use Meloetta to race still seems to be an effective strategy here. You also seem pretty unfazed by the Chien-Pao matchup. Iron Hands isn't something you have to be concerned about, nor do you have to be concerned with Iron Valiant. Actually, Fusion Energy is hilarious into Valiant. They can't even get the extra ping damage on certain Pokemon. The Entei build has a much better chance than the likes of the Urshifu build and even the Jolteon build. However, they're still reliant on, you know, lots of ropes and all this other stuff to target down Genesects over the game. The main matchup to dodge continues to be the Charizard EX. I actually feel this matchup falls off even harder because there are going to be players not playing the Pidgeot build and actually converting to the Technical Machine Evolution Bibarel build, and I think this holds up much better against Path Iono and Path Judge and that sort of thing, where you're just trying to cross your fingers that you can disrupt the Charizard from getting many of them into play, and the Evo build makes it so easy for them to just continue on with their game plan and push through your VMAXs. I have made builds for both the Fusion and the DTE. We're going to start off with the Fusion build. I think this should be the most popular, and I think this has the best time into Roaring Moon, so therefore becomes the best pick. This is still a pretty vanilla, straightforward list. I think there are some justification for a couple of the cards, though. We're playing the cheeky 2 counter Path to the Peak, because I do think it is pretty solid right now and can be a win condition going first into Roaring Moon, and is still giving you a bit of protection against Charizard. We then have the double turbo energy list. Again, nothing too crazy here. We're incorporating the TM Devolution to try and give ourselves a different way of stopping Charizard. This is much more effective if you're expecting the Pidgeot build. Really quite poor, actually, if you're expecting the TM Evolution build. So that one's really up to you, depending on which build you're expecting to be most popular at the LAIC. I'm also trying to incorporate a counter catcher, giving you a little bit more gust. It's another item card at the very least for Cramomatic, and I do think this deck plays fairly well from behind, where you have those Iono Path combinations. Countercatcher can make some more cool things happen, and it's also partly why I've reincorporated the Oricorio. You can do some pretty cheeky glistening droplets plays. I know it's only 5 damage counters, so it's not a huge amount, but you can set Pokemon into range if you're just falling short of knockouts, which I thought was a pretty interesting inclusion. The actual main reason why I'm playing the Oricorio, and why you saw both Ice-Q and Meloetta in the previous build, is that I'm quite scared of Collapsed and Avery, actually, in a handful of archetypes now, so just having a higher bulk of Pokemon in the deck list was the main consideration for this card. For other options, if we're talking the DTE based list, I think Luxray Grabber is something that we've experimented with in the past and could be pretty reasonable. If we're thinking about the Fusion Strike list, I think Catcher could make the deck more aggressive and again lean into those high roll situations. I also think Justified Gloves is actually a pretty reasonable inclusion right now, helps out against the Roaring Moon matchup, which actually can get pretty chunky, and of course gives you some better reach into Charizard, which is your worst matchup. And then Professor Churro's scenario seems like a pretty straight upgrade to the Penny supporter, because you can also pick up some damaged VMAXs and still do high damage output with another Mew in the turn, rather than being forced into a low damage output Psychic Leap play. Into our top 5 then, and we have Lost Zone Box. The community weren't that high on the archetype, but it still seems to be doing fairly well, definitely better in the West than the East. And interestingly enough, it seems like the Radiant Charizard build of Lost Box has made a big resurgence, and its data is actually looking really appealing. Its unfavourables are Lugia, which, you know, was kind of low in our top 10, and Entei Valiant, which I wanted to talk about, but it actually hasn't made it onto our top 10 whatsoever. So its unfavourables are looking less popular right now, probably individually less than 10% of the field you would expect. It seems pretty even into Gardevoir. It's actually crazy that this isn't much stronger. It seems to have a really good time into Charizard. We're playing the Technical Machine Devolution package in here. We have a decent Roaring Moon matchup thanks to Radiant Zard being so stupidly overstatted for a single prize mon and being recyclable in the matchup. Same thing for the Miraidon matchup, same thing for the Goldengo matchup, and it's also pretty powerful into Giratina as well, because we're basically always playing the Jirachi, and we have a decent amount of speed on our side, of course, and again, Charizard is really solid whenever they are putting multi-prizes down. Similar story for Chien-Pao. As long as you have the instant response to the Iron Hands, it shouldn't be too awkward of a matchup, and you actually enjoy seeing many lists cutting clone altogether. So it seems like Lost Box did find a way to adapt and is still performing pretty well at the highest level. Another crucial reason why the Radiant Charizard build has been making this big resurgence, it's another deck that can really take full advantage of that counter catcher. We play only 1 copy of Roxanne in this list, but you have it alongside the catcher in many situations, and you can Lost Mine down the barrels or other Pokemon whilst trapping some chunkier stuff in the active position, and force your opponent to have guaranteed switch outs then and there, as well as other pieces of their combo. Radiant Charizard always played second fiddle to Turbo, because it often found its way to 10 cards in the Lost Zone a lot slower than Turbo builds. Well, now having a Stellar Veil Jirachi has meant that that's far less of an issue for you, and with the double Super Rod, the double Clara, you know, you're going to be pretty safe to protect your board with Jirachi and Manaphy as that combination these days. As you can see, we're trying to support the Radiant Charizard with 2 copies of Raihan, as well as those Poké Gear, 1 copy of Double Turbo Energy, and 1 copy of Mirage Gate. So the idea is we can get a pretty early Combustion Blast after the opponent has taken 2 prize cards with an Iron Hands. And if we're able to do that, they've just done a 2-for-2 trade, and you should be able to stabilize from then on with the remainder of your single prizes. At the moment, I'm playing Drapion V. I think it's better to play a hard tech card for the Mew matchup, because I just do respect it, and I think it's a really hard one if you don't play the Drapion. But I could also see some consideration for Spiritomb coming into the deck list for being a softer tech card, but also having value into the Lugia matchup, as well as the Control matchup where you shut down the Rotom. The other Lost Zone deck list I wanted to talk about was Roaring Moon. I think this is kind of being slept on right now. It's doing very well in Japan, and the logic of the archetype is that you're basically Tina with more space, because you just play 2 Roaring Moon rather than a 3-3 package of the Tinas themselves. You do lose out on Abyss Seeking, but you sort of gain that back in space for consistency cards in many regards. The supporter lineup looks very similar to Tina. You get to play Counter Catcher, you play those Path of the Peak, which is just a headache in the game right now. And as we've seen, Roaring Moon is just a super overstatted, silly card. It can hit 220 very effectively. It has that Frenzied Gouging to get through some Charizard, to get through some Iron Hands if it really has to. And then, of course, you gain that great type coverage for the Guardians and the Mews naturally in the deck as well. For other options, Vitality Band's actually a pretty interesting one. I think it's pretty reasonable in the Roaring Moon deck. I think it's an upgrade to Articuno that we've seen in some Lost Box decks of the past, where it still gives you that means of getting through a Cresselia with a Cram, but then it also gives your Roaring Moon a chance of hitting 230, which is a crucial threshold right now. And if you are playing Raihan in your deck list, it's not that inconceivable to try and make this combo come off. Maybe it's a little bit niche, but I do think it's reasonable to consider because there are some important 230 hit point Pokemon in the game, Roaring Moon and Iron Hands being the premium ones. Switching over to the Radiant Charizard build, I've actually experimented a lot with a Bibarel engine. I actually like a 1 Bidoof 2 Bibarel combination. The idea being you have so much basic ball search in that deck list, and you can get a Bidoof established pretty early. You also play Hisuian if ever your Bidoof is prized, and then you play 2 copies of Bibarel, knowing that you can Colress or Comfey 1 into the Lost Zone and still have the chance to develop Industrious Incisors. Of course, Radiant Charizard tries to go down to the nitty-gritty of the late game. That's where it's strongest, that's where Charizard is most effective. So giving yourself Bibarel to top up on those cards towards the latter game when you've already thinned out a ton of things through flower selectings means you're not going to get ruined by Ionos and other annoying disruptors. You also gain a small advantage with Ultra Ball being able to get rid of VIPs that just naturally come into your hand, and gives you a way of discarding Fire Energy, which can also activate your Raihans earlier. Currently we're playing Radiant Greninja in our Roaring Moon base list, but you could think about going down a Charizard route in there as well. I've seen a lot of Japanese lists playing both Roaring Moon and Charizard in their deck, but an alternative to that is having Glaring Moltres in the list and maybe adding in a Clara as well, so you give yourself this Fiery Wrath option, which isn't quite as good as Charizard, but still can come online and again has great synergy with that Clara, decent synergy with Raihan Gate anyway. So I think it could be another one prize option that you could consider in the deck list to continue having high damage outputs, but maintaining single prize board states. Next up we have Charizard EX. The community are a little bit colder on this one, but Japan seem to be loving Charizard. They really are backing it to the hilt. It feels as though the technical machine evolution Bibarel based lists have really taken over in Japan. There are still a decent number playing Pidgeot, but points earning wise, the Bibarel really is their front runner. Its matchup spread is pretty interesting. It's still concerned about the Lost Zone engines, of course, and there is potential for technical machine devolution to come into some of these lists as well. And it seems like Gardevoir also has a decent time into Charizard. They just have so much more draw power, so many plays available to them, especially with Counter Catcher coming into their deck list as well. It feels like they can normally find a way to squeeze out a decent prize map against you. And most of the time you don't have enough ways of getting around Snorlax Stall either. However, it looks like you're favorable into a ton of other matchups. Having a decent time against Roaring Moon is really nice because they're forced into Frenzied Gouging, which opens up your single prize attackers to come in. Sometimes even a Charmander can finish them off. Sometimes it's the Radiant Charizard, of course. And you're going to be the player in control of Iono, trying to disrupt them. You're always going to be pretty good into the Mew matchup. Lugia still seems pretty good. The numbers line up pretty well. And Miraidon, as long as you can get around Path, is going to be fine. The first list we're going to look at is a technical machine evolution based build with these Arvans coming into the deck list. You can see in this list it's pretty straightforward. We're trying to get that TM evolution. We'll choose to go second with the deck list. We have a decent amount of ball search. We have the Artisans to help get multiple Pokemon into play. And the idea is that Arvan can tutor out the TM as well as VIP pass, so we can get multiple Charmander developed, and Bidoof, so you can go immediately into Charmeleon and Bibarel. We're playing a Professor Churro and a Collapsadium to try and get rid of things like Luminion and Entei, which can help us out in the opening stages for setup, because we also play the Forest Seal Stone, but also adds to an extra switch count in the deck. Counter Catcher's great in here and is tutorable via Arvan. I also love playing Defiance Band right now. I think 230 is such a crucial threshold that when there are decks that are going to take a single prize against you, you have that instant response Defiant Band to now get all the way up to 240, which is going to also help out against Roaring Moon. And let's not forget that we are playing the Jirachi Tech card, which should be helping our weaker matchups, the Lost Zone builds. Then, of course, we have the more traditional Pidgeot build of Zard. I used to call it Arvan Zard, but now both lists play Arvan, so we're calling it Pidgeot Zard now. And again, I'm incorporating the Defiance Band. We're playing the Counter Catcher. We're playing the Churro. Outside of that, it's pretty streamlined, pretty straightforward, pretty much where it was. I can definitely see a debate to making another space to try and fit in the Jirachi in this list as well, but I'm kind of hoping that the Lost Cities still do a pretty good number over some of these Lost Zone builds, and they also help out into the Gardevoir matchup. For tech options, Toadscruel has been that hot topic. I've already done a deck list on this so you can see what I've cut to fit in the Toedscrolls. I was kind of underwhelmed by them, but they do have obvious potential if you're expecting enough Chien-Pao, enough Roaring Moon. These are both worth considering. I know some people prefer playing Pidgeots to the Entei, and I think that's also a reasonable choice. And both lists should strongly consider Town Store, coming in as at least a 1 count into their deck list to improve their odds of hitting that Forest Hill Stone, and in the case of the Bibarel list, the TM Evolution. Coming into our top 3, and the community have rated Roaring Moon first. It's by far the most popular list, both online and in the Japanese format by the looks of things, and it seems to be appearing in their top 16s over and over again. Its matchup spread is interesting. It's a turbo archetype with multiple 2-prize Pokemon that always hit the board. That's normally going to play into the hands of Gardevoir, despite Roaring Moon having a decent weakness into them. Lost Zone Box, again, has that Radiant Charizard, plays Lost Vacuums to get around the Ancient Capsules, so you're getting through Roaring Moon pretty effectively. You're forced to Frenzy Gouge into Charizard, which allows them to also weave in their single-prize Pokemon alongside Iono. And Lugia, again, is an abuser of Radiant Charizard, and they can even use Iron Hands, actually. If you are forced to gouge through a Lugia V-Star, they can come in and Iron Hands respond for a 3-prize KO and swing things back in their favor, especially because Iron Hands has that annoying hit points which forces another Brute Bonnet combination, or they would have to gouge again into you, opening up like a single prize attacker, even an Archeops itself, plus an Iono player from the Lugia side. It does seem to enjoy the Chien-Pao matchup and the Miraidon. These are both, 220 hit point thresholds that you can get through pretty nicely. You're a pretty chunky dude as well, forcing a lot out of them in the opening stages of the game. And this deck is relatively even into the Mew matchup, the Giratina matchup, and the Entei Valiant. I think that's a pretty interesting one. It actually farmed the other Valiant builds that are out there as well, so another thing to bear in mind if you expect other builds to be in the equation. This is the list I'm currently rocking with, still kind of turbo based, but I am still incorporating the booster capsules and the Brute Bonnet. I do feel like they're reasonable cards. Again, that 230 threshold seems to be so important to me, because I am still worried about the mirror match, I am still worried about Iron Hands, of course, so being able to Toxic Powder, get over the line is pretty important to me. I love the high item density plus the Pokestops. Cross Switcher seems like a really solid option, and I do like making the space for Trekking Shoes in addition to your concealed cards and whatnot to help you push towards your combo, because this deck should be all about trying to get that turn 1 attack. Currently I'm playing 1 Energy Switch, and I do think that's contentious. It could be a much higher count, and we have seen a lot of that. At the moment I'm just playing the 1 copy, but I could definitely see this increasing as well. What I find most interesting about Roaring Moon is that it's being successful in so many different ways, which is both a good and bad thing, because you basically have to try out every single build if you want to come to the correct conclusion. There's an argument around playing Galarian Moltres plus a higher count of Energy Switch to give yourself even more ways of getting a turn 1 attack, and also opens up a Forest Hill Stone V-Star power for you. And, you can't say no to a comp search in a combo-based deck where this can be the final piece of your puzzle to actually get an attack off, as well as being some potential Iono proofing on the board. Speaking of which, you could definitely think about having Bibarel over Mew EX, or just making space for it altogether. This is actually really popular in Japan. We've seen 1-1 lines and 2-2 lines gather a lot of points in that region, so I do think it could be a reasonable inclusion. With so many items in the deck list, Mysterious Tail is basically always hitting, and it's going to help you out get your dart patches, get your switch cards, cross switches of course, so also seems like a pretty nice combo enabler. Darkrai V-Star could be an alternative V-Star power to the Forest Hill Stone, gets back cross switches, can get back different item cards, dart patches, and can actually be a pretty high hit point beat stick into single prize matchups. Palpad's always an interesting one when we are playing Pokestops and slamming them. We have low counts of Boss and Iono, so that could certainly make its way into the list. And there's also some debate whether or not you should be playing some colorless energy in your deck. Roaring Moon does have a colorless in its attack cost, so there is only limited downside to playing some of these special energy or water energy in the deck list. And there are of course upsides here. Jet Energy provides an extra out for Snorlax and just in general getting a pivot into the active position. Jet Energy could be a great way to Iono proof yourself. And the Water Energy Quad Energy Search package enables the deck to have a Radiant Greninja attacking play. The idea being that you Sada 2 Water Energy onto your Roaring Moon, then Energy switch them onto Greninja and get a snipe play off with a single prize mon. For a deck as fast and doesn't have much combat potential, I do think the Greninja build is very viable, even though it does take up a lot of space. And I think just that the existence of this water package makes other players play differently into Roaring Moon, because not only do they have to fear a 220 damage output attack coming into their active Pokemon and maybe force them to put a 1-prizer in the active going first, it may also force them to get a Mana Feed developed as well. So it's something I would definitely watch out for in the LAIC, and if your hand is good enough, try and develop that Mana Feed if you're coming up against a Roaring Moon that's going second. In at number 2 then, we have Lost Zone Giratina. Giratina, doing extremely well in Japan and still doing pretty well in PTG Live as well. Feels like we're all Tina skeptics and need to see it to believe it. That's always the way these things go. Countercatcher being the new toy that this archetype gets, which actually is a monster buff for the archetype, I'll be honest with you. Tina was always comfortable going down prize cards and was living from behind, hoping that the hand disruptors, the path of the peaks, were going to stabilize you in the mid game. And Countercatcher plays into that really nicely. It gives you a turn 2 Gust play now after using Colruses, and it gives you those late game Roxanne plays alongside Sableye. So I do think Tina and Guardi are the best comeback decks in the game now. For unfavorable matchups, it doesn't particularly enjoy seeing Lugia, and is also pretty awkward against the Radzard lost boxes as well as the Roaring Moon lost box. However, beyond that, the coast is clear for Giratina. Seems to really be strong into Charizard, seems pretty good into Valiant. Honestly, it just feels like it has everything at its disposal. It has the higher damage output when it's required, it has the sneaky single prizes, and it has all the comeback in the world. Giratina can do it all, it's just whether or not it can do it consistently every single game. One final caveat that I want to say is that in Japan they of course play best of one, and I do think Giratina is one of the sort of trap decks in the game that can find itself tying quite a lot because of just how many even matchups it has, / its lack of consistency, forcing you to actually tie matchups where you could be favored and have lines in play to win. Sometimes your opponent gets out of the Roxanne, or sometimes Tina doesn't really get out the gates fast enough, and then in 50 minutes is unrecoverable and you can't end up winning a best of 3. So its data is really, really strong, but really bear in mind that it's doing much better in these best of 1 tournaments. And I think everyone falls into that pitfall that Tina does find itself tying a lot. Trust me, I played a ton of Tina. I played it at Worlds. I played it since then. And I've fallen into the trap myself where these Lost Zone engines take so long and it can really suffer because of it. However, my deck list is really vanilla, actually. We're just adding in the Countercatchers. I do choose to play no Boss's Orders. I think Boss just sucked in the deck, honestly, and you kind of had to play the card, whereas Countercatcher just seems like a dream. It might take some finessing to create prize maps where you don't need to Gust, but of course you have bench access via Moonlight Shuriken, via Lost Mine as well, so it's not really a huge loss for the deck list. And honestly, I found myself getting rid of Boss into the Lost Zone in so many situations just to get set up, and I'm much happier seeing that Countercatcher come into the list. For other options, like I said, if you don't like being forced down strange prize map avenues and, you know, can sometimes be denied from your opponent playing Jirachi or your opponent playing Collapsed or Churro when you're trying to set up intricate math to stay behind on a prize race, Boss's Orders could be a pretty reasonable inclusion. Similarly, if you're worried about the Lost Zone matchups, you could just include a Jirachi in your own end, then you have a pretty decent mirror match and a better time into the Radzard lost box. Spiritomb's a pretty interesting one. Lugia is one of your weaker matchups. It also helps out against Mew and also gives you bonus points into the Snorlax Stall matchups. I see Spiritomb in a lot of Japanese deck lists, and I think it is worth considering because it does carry a lot of weight. And Lost Vacuum's a kind of interesting one. Again, there's just a lot of health buff tools right now, and the fact that Roaring Moon sits at 290, if they're going to use Roaring Moon just to get through your single prizes, a Lost Vacuum could be a great way to put them down into range of a Tina without committing to your V-Star power. It's also going to help you ramp your Lost Zone in general, and can be a way to bounce your own path if you need to dig again with Greninja. Onto our number 1 deck then. Even with Iron Valiant and Iron Hands both coming out in the format, it feels like Gardevoir still has what it takes to be the top deck. It's been the best point earner in the online scene and the 3rd best performer in Japan. It has lost ground into the Miraidon matchup, which previously used to be pretty reasonable for you, because that is of course an Iron Hands user, and that is sometimes an issue for you, especially when they can combine it with Hand Disruption and Path to the Peak. The Snorlax matchup is also pretty woeful for you. You really don't play enough outs to get around them. And the Valiant variants are quite awkward. Interestingly, you're quite solid into the Urshifu build, because of course, as long as you make an EX Pokemon, you can have a really easy way of taking a ton of prize cards. However, you definitely suffer against the Entei Valiant and the Jolteon Valiant, even the Palkia Valiants. There's so many ways that you can try and play Iron Valiant these days, and I do think one will have a breakout performance. So that does give me some cause for concern. However, the rest of the data looks really, really solid. It seems to have improved its Charizard matchup. Its Lugia matchup's improved with Screamtail. Roaring Moon is a new matchup that's obviously using tons of multi-prizes, which you can always catch up on. Your Mew matchup is getting slightly more favorable, especially if you're going to be incorporating the Avery into your deck list. The data for Chien-Pao has always been pretty generous for Guardi, just because it's much more of a consistent archetype, but again, you now have Avery plus Screamtail, which can disrupt their board pretty nicely. And in general, Gardevoir seems to be a big winner, because once again, it gets to incorporate Countercatcher into its deck list. Again, Gardevoir is typically going behind in a prize race, and can definitely catch up with all sorts of combinations with Hand Disruption, Gust, spread options from Cress and Screamtail. It can do so much. The The first build I'm going to show you is kind of like a traditional build of Gardevoir where you still have the couple candies in the deck list. You mostly play Iono, but then you support this with a copy of Worker to give you an extra supporter bounce and some extra draw power. But Avery has come into the deck list and is a really big card for Gardevoir, actually. The main reason why Avery has become so much stronger is that you can pair this up with Countercatcher and put them down to a low bench, then pick off another Pokemon. So, for example, against Baxcalibur, you can get rid of, a Frigibax with the Avery and then Countercatcher the Baxcalibur and then leave your opponent with no response. Or you can do a similar thing with Avery into Screamtail or into Cress and really limit a ton of your opponent's options. At the same time, Countercatcher plus Scream or Cress alongside Iono, it's like the holy trinity of combat potential. Seems like Guardian Tina do it the best, and just having this bench pressure alongside the hand disruption is a massive new play that the deck has available to it. I am playing the Churro scenario plus Pal-Pad. It gives you a bit of respect to Snorlax, but still probably not enough. But Churro has upside anyway in trying to represent single prize board states. I then just want to touch on the TM Evolution build of Gardevoir, which I've been experimenting a ton with, to be honest with you. The main reason I was playing this build so much was that I was kind of afraid of Iron Hands. I thought that just a turn 2 hands from Miraidon players and Baxcalibur players was going to be hell for Gardevoir, and I wanted to have Arven TM Evolution to get me double Curlier developed early enough that I could respond on an Iron Hands quite easily. However, it doesn't seem like the world is forming around exactly Iron Hands based decks and then things that can counter it, and the format seems to just be wide enough that Gardevoir can sort of take the bad matchup to Miraidon now and can take a pretty reasonable matchup to Baxcalibur because you have enough combat potential. So even though I love the Arvengarde, I do expect more people to play the more traditional build with just the heavy Iono and Avery and whatnot. But that said, if you do expect a ton of Iron Hands to be around, I do think TM Evolution is still worth experimenting with. And just in general, having Luminion, Forest Hill Stone is just a really nice package to have. You'll notice in both the lists I was still playing Zacian V, and we'll touch on that in a moment. As we get onto the other options, I think on the right-hand side of the screen, that Luxurious Cape has kind of been a big talking point as of late. I've seen a number of lists cutting Zacian altogether and just saying that Lux Cape alongside Screamtail and alongside Shining Arcana is the way to go. The main upside being you, of course, then can never start a 2-prize Pokemon because you're not playing any 2-prizes, which is going to be helpful. And the fact that Luxurious Cape goes onto Screamtail means that not only can you have high damage output onto the active, but also you can have a really high damage output snipe attack as well. I have a couple gripes actually with Luxurious Cape compared to the Zacian. I feel like Zacian is still an okay early game option to just accelerate Psychic Energy out of your deck, especially against the Lost Zone matchups. It's also very searchable towards the latter stages of the game, unlike the Cape, which you kind of just have to find if you are getting hit with Ionos. Sometimes your lines of play can be shut off from you, whereas the Zacian still has, your remaining Fog Crystals and Ultra Balls as additional outs to find the card. And of course, you can just proactively put down the Zacian, which is a little bit better than the Cape, I would say. However, my main reason for liking Zacian over Cape is Lost City. I think there's still going to be Mew and there's still going to be Charizard builds that are playing Lost City. I actually expect more people to play Pidgeot over the barrel engines, and if that's the case, then they are going to be playing those cities, so having the Arcana and the Screamtail taken off the board for the rest of the game means the Cape can no longer find avenues to get into those latter stages. I know we have seen lists play triple Arcana, but there is some flawed logic there, where your opponent is still lost zoning your Curlies and Rolts, so that's still going to be a huge issue for you. And of course, at that stage, the Cape is not just one additional space taking up in the list, you then have to find space again in the list to add in an extra attacker in the Gardevoir. All that is to say that it's still pretty close with Zacian, and I need to experiment more with Cape because its upsides are still massive. If we want to talk about other tools, Jelly is also a pretty interesting one, where you can damage an Arcana and then Jelly your way out of Iron Hands ranged to at least make life more awkward for them. And of course, it still has upside into the Lost Zone matchups. Speaking of which, I'm not really teching a huge amount for either of them. I'm playing Churro, I'm playing Collapsed, and I'm playing Crest still, but I'm not playing Jirachi and Mew EX. Mew being much better into the Giratina matchup, which I do think is very solid, and can find other avenues for being a strong attacker. The Jirachi is going to help out much more against the Valiant variants, where you're not going to get Yoga Looped, and also going to be very strong against Sableye. At the moment, I think Crest is kind of like that more well-rounded card, where it's still going to find value being able to knock out early Bidoof, early Frigibax, early Pidgey, those sorts of things. So I like the more well-rounded card when we're in this wide format. However, I definitely see the value in these tech inclusions if you expect the matchups to be popular enough. And then just a final note on Professor's research, playing these silly draw threes sometimes really can feel bad when then you're only supporter in hand. And ultimately, research is a huge dig into the deck where you see a ton of options, and it can be a massive way for you to springboard, sometimes hit your candy combinations, and give you another avenue to actually get around an Iron Hands in the opening stages. That's it for the top 10 then. 10. However, I did just want to discuss a few other archetypes out there right now. I think Valiant is still figuring out what's best. You'll notice I put Entei on the matchup data. I think that has the most appealing data between that and Urshifu. I think Jolteon hasn't really had enough data around it to really see its matchups in full potential. And I've also seen a number of Japanese Palkia builds of Valiant as well, which still has this aggressive attacking option in the Palkia itself, but then can use Greninja as a spreader, similar to Urshifu. And I think that also could have some legs as well. Because I still think Lost Box is certainly around and Guardia is still around, I do think Valiant is going to be reasonable, and it really wouldn't surprise me if Valiant ended up making a top 8. From there, it's kind of the best of the rest. I think Goldengo has proven that it can't quite cope with the amount of path in the game right now. It's still a little bit too linear. It doesn't really have enough of the sort of comeback cards required to be one of the top decks in the game, despite, you know, having a decent one-prize attacker in Sizzle more often than not, or having the Basket Legion combo that actually also allows you to get a multiple Gimmighoul into play. I feel like this is just a little bit shy of the mark because it seems too one-dimensional. Clorftrode is an aggressive single-prize archetype that has good type coverage into Charizard and Roaring Moon, but it does feel that we're in a much wider field and we need to have better matchups around the board. I will always say be aware of Arc V-Star. It can be a Judge Path deck, and that does feel strong in the game right now, and surely there's a combination of attackers that you can put into your deck list to cover your other matchups that may look awkward on paper. And finally, I did want to have a note on Palkia Chien-Pao. For those of you who are frustrated with the lack of consistency of Iron Hands, I do think there could be an amalgamation of Palkia, Radiant Greninja, Chien-Pao, Suicune, possibly with Melanie. That could be another decent racing deck in the game. Palkia gaining Vessel is actually a pretty big card for it. It also gains Countercatcher, which is really nice in an Irida package as well. I feel like this is being underplayed for how powerful of a deck it is. And again, I feel like it's one of the higher consistency decks in the game, so I do respect it as an archetype. That's it then for my top 10 decks. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know what you thought about the deck lists, the placing of these lists, the overall points totals as well. Did these surprise you? And let me know what you're testing yourself heading into the LAIC, the regionals, as well as all the cups as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.